Thank you very much. I'm a bit worried because I have to remember to say, next slide, please. So if I get lost in this, that's why. It's been really lovely to listen to you, and I'm looking forward to hearing all the other speakers as well. So next slide, please. Just my contact details in case you want them. Next slide, please. So I'm just going to tell you what I'm going to tell you. So I'm going to talk about the House of Commons Education Committee report that came out recently. And I'm going to be asking, were the reforms, as the report said, the right ones for disabled children? And I also want to think a little bit about how rights are understood in the SEN system. And then I want to think about resistance and how we might imagine otherwise. So drawing on the Portman's kind of, let's think about this in a different way. And so suggest that the arts is a brilliant space to do that. And then just say a little bit about utopias. So next slide, please. So as many of you will be aware, I should have said, I will say all the words on the slides and I'll describe any of the pictures that are necessary for meaning. So there's a picture of the report on the slide. So on the 16th of October, the House of Commons Education Committee published its report on special educational needs and disabilities. Now, this is an important record of the failings of the current system. It documents the lack of accountability in the system and the lack of rigorous inspection. It highlights the need for oversight, as it describes the Department for Education as having serenely provided over chaos for the last 5 years. I was interested to hear in the beginning people talking about nurseries getting outstanding status, and I think that is clear that that can't be happening, or shouldn't be happening when schools are not inclusive schools or settings. So the report details the treacle of bureaucracy that parents wade through, that we've heard about already, and the burden put on parents' shoulders. And forgive me, but note the gender-neutral term, erasing the work that primarily mothers of disabled children do to fight for their children's education. So local authorities, it says, are ignoring the law. There's still not enough employment and training opportunities for young people post-16. Health and social care is still not working. The local offer, which is supposed to document the support in your local authority, is described as useless. And the Department for Education stands accused of adopting a sticking plaster approach to reforming the system. So this report concludes that a generation of children are being let down. You don't need me to tell you that this report is pretty grim. And I was pleased to see that the committee were documenting what was happening for children and families. And I think that some of the recommendations in the report, if implemented, could make a positive change in children's lives. But, and this for me is a big but, I think that both the SEND reforms and the committee's report are fundamentally flawed. Sadly, I don't think either have the potential to enable the kind of radical change that is needed to change the lives of children and young people categorised as having special educational needs and disabilities. So let me try and explain why. So next slide, please. So the report boldly states the SEND reforms were the right ones, and I disagree. Now, there's an interesting question here about who does or doesn't have the authority to say what's right or wrong in policy terms. And I think it's important to be open and say that I was invited here, I think, because I'm a professor of education at the University of Sheffield, but I'm also the mother of a son who's now 23, and he's been through the SEN system. And so my arguments are very much shaped by both those experiences. So I'm going to explain why I disagree that these were the right reforms, and think about two questions that are sort of hidden in the title of my talk. And they were the reforms the right reforms for labelled children, and how are disabled children's rights understood in the context of special education? Next slide, please. So it seems to me that the answer to the first question, were these the right reforms, is just a flat no. Of course, I agree with the committee that there's been a failure to implement the reforms, and there is a need for greater accountability and oversight, but there are fundamental issues not addressed by the reforms or the committee's report. So the first for me is the failure to address what inclusion means in schools and how this is experienced by children. The legislation assumes that there's a shared understanding of what inclusive education could and should look like, and we just don't have that. We still have inclusion units in mainstream schools that in some cases just effectively separate students labelled with special educational needs from other children. We still have children sitting in corridors with their teaching assistants while the rest of the class work in the classroom with the teacher. We still have seclusion rooms or booths where children sit for weeks or even months on end in so-called inclusive schools. The number of children who are home educated with SEND has risen massively. And I'm not talking about people who make an ideological choice to educate their children at home, but parents who just feel that the system isn't working for their children and withdraw them. So we can't take it for granted that we all agree what inclusion is, and we need a conversation about that. Linked to this problem of understanding what inclusion is, we also have to pay attention to what's described as a marketised system of education and how this, I think, negatively impacts on all children and disproportionately on disabled children. So we all know that schools and teachers are measured against performance targets, and good schools attract more money and more funding. Schools need to do well by children to thrive. Unfortunately, doing well by their children is framed in very narrow terms and fails to capture the achievements of children who are not traditionally academic. And in the marketised system, children with SEND become the problem. They are thought of as threatening the school's ability to do well in the league tables and reducing their ability to recruit and reducing the school's income further. Some schools, and we all know this, do their best to deter disabled students. We've all heard stories about parents being told that the school down the road is better for children like yours. An inclusive policy becomes unsustainable in a marketised system in which children with additional learning needs of any kind that demand additional resources, become a problem. And right at the heart of all of this is a failure to address the language of education for disabled children. Next slide, please. So SEN is still defined by an individual child's difficulties and within-child deficits. So if, sadly like me, you know the legislation because you've been fighting, you might know this quote. But a child of compulsory school age or a person has a learning difficulty or disability if he or she has a significantly greater difficulty in learning than the majority of others of the same age, or has a disability which prevents or hinders him or her from making use of facilities of a kind generally provided for others of the same age in mainstream schools or post-16 institutions. Next slide, please. Now, you might wonder, given the grim account of the education system I started with, why I want to focus on language. Well, it's clear to me through my research and my personal experience that the language that we use matters. So, for example, that seemingly everyday phrase, a child with special educational needs, suggests that special educational needs and disabilities is something that a child has. But describing a young person or a student as a young person with special educational needs isn't just a description of what somebody has. The category of SEND is only and always given to a child in a particular context. That's why people talk about removing the barriers to children's learning. Different environments create or prevent children's learning and participation. The current language of policy is deeply problematic because it always positions the child with SEND as the potential problem in the education system, not what's going on around them. They're positioned as the problem. The policy is underpinned by a deficit model of disabled children, and this has haunted their lives since the Warnock Report 40 years ago. In the current language of policy, children with SEND are effectively described as being not quite like other children, and this is a really risky position to be in. As we've recently seen in the media, a headline now amended after complaints suggested that the special needs, note the absence of the word children here, were diverting resources away from other pupils. The headline seemed at best or to forget, or at worst, not to believe that children with special needs are actually children and pupils too. And it reminded me of when my children were little, and at my son's school, I regularly heard teaching assistants talking about taking the special needs out. And one day my daughter had a friend home from tea, and she asked me as she got out of the car, is your son a special need? No, I said, he's a boy. I expect many of you have got similar stories to tell. So the SEND reforms were not the right reforms because they failed to address the question of inclusion, the problem of the marketised system, and the language which sorts and separates children into the category of not quite like us and ultimately not quite a child. So let me move to my second question. Next slide, please. How are rights understood in the context of SEND? And so here I want to return to what I wrote in the lovely book that you all have on your chairs, and just read a little bit from that. So next slide, please. If I tell you that I need a chocolate biscuit, you can tell me I don't have a right to it, and you can choose whether or not you give me that biscuit. Similarly, if we describe some children as having special educational needs, not rights, then there is a sense that meeting that need is optional. If we agree that non-disabled children have a right to their education, then so should disabled children, regardless of whether or not some or all of that education is labelled as special. Education is a right for all. Education is not a chocolate biscuit. Now, I realise I actually should have said education isn't champagne, because sometimes when I give this talk, people get out chocolate biscuits. So maybe I should have set the bar a bit higher and said it wasn't champagne, but I hope you get the point. So we use the language of need in education every day without paying any attention to the fact that some children have needs while other children have rights. Now, I'm not claiming that disabled children are the only children who've been excluded. I recognise that disability intersects with other forms of marginalisation, including racism, sexism and poverty. And yet, despite a growing number of international and domestic human rights conventions and charters, progress in securing inclusion and full citizenship for disabled people has been limited. A host of statistics remind us of the marginalisation of disabled children in education and beyond. Children with SEND are 7 times more likely to be excluded from school than non-disabled children. They're more likely to spend time in isolation, more likely to experience restraint and medication, and some are incarcerated from institutions away from home. And we see almost daily news stories that reveal disabled children's rightlessness, their exclusions from communities. And we know from the Learning from Death's Mortality Review that children with learning disabilities' life expectancies is 20 to 30 years less than their non-disabled peers. We need to call out the language shift that makes education a right for some and need for others. Next slide, please. So I've talked, and there's no denying it, things are pretty grim. But I honestly don't believe that things are hopeless. And I do believe that things could be different. And so I want to spend some time thinking about how things could be different. And so I'm going to go back to 1959 and the American sociologist C. Wright Mills, who coined the term sociological imagination. And what Wright Mills encourages us to do is to step back from a situation and look at it again, and to understand what we're experiencing as individuals as part of the wider picture. So in this way, we can step back, or try to step back. It's really hard to step back when you're in the middle of a fight over your kids' education, but we'll try to step back from that. And think about how the system is the thing that's producing children as the problem. So we're all experiencing those problems day to day, but it's the system that's making those things happen. And then once we've kind of tried to recognise that, we have to step away and think, okay, how could it be if we try to imagine a system where no child is produced as a problem in education? Next slide, please. So there's a picture here of a mask, and it says at the side, get married, have kids, work at Apple HQ, dream big, be brave, and courageous is the other word. So this was from a workshop that we did with young people as part of a project that we're involved with at the university. And what we wanted them to do, I guess, as well, was imagine things otherwise. But imagining things could be different is often a difficult thing to do, especially, I think, when you're bogged down in the day-to-day of, running a home, getting the kids to school. And this is where I think that the arts can help us. I think they have a vital role to play, because engaging with the arts means engaging with the imagination, and the arts can be made open and accessible to everyone, and that's why we were keen to work with artists in the research project with disabled young people. And I think the arts can be political, with a big or a small p, and the arts can help us to see injustice and address power imbalances. Next slide, please. So I'm really interested from everyone here about how engaging the arts might spark ideas about different possibilities for children in education and in their wider communities, and for the families too. So engaging the arts can build connections and much needed collective strength and solidarity when times feel tough for us all. And so I hope we're going to be able to see later and that we can start to imagine better worlds, or even perhaps utopias, for all our children. Thank you very much.